You don't walk into my bank with a $20 million check looking like that, Richard Collins said, and the sound of tearing paper followed like a verdict already passed. The rip was clean, deliberate, echoing louder than it should have in a room lined with polished marble and glass. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft hum of printers seemed to hesitate. Ava Johnson didn't move. The two halves of the check drifted down between them, brushing the edge of the counter before landing at her feet, the number still visible in bold ink, $20 million, now split like it never meant anything at all. She stood there, hands loosely folded in front of her, her posture calm in a space that had suddenly become too sharp, too cold. The fluorescent lights above reflected faintly off the tiled floor, catching the edge of her worn sneakers, the crease of her simple coat, the quiet steadiness in her breathing. Around her, the room adjusted. A woman near the entrance slowly lowered her phone, though not before angling it just right. A teller behind the counter exchanged a look with a colleague, eyebrows raised, lips pressed tight as if holding back commentary that didn't need words. Richard straightened his tie, the gesture automatic, practiced, as if restoring order to a moment he believed he controlled. We have protocols, he added, voice measured now, but still edged with something colder than professionalism. People try things like this all the time. Ava's eyes followed the pieces of the check for a brief second before lifting again, meeting his without challenge, without fear. There was no anger there. That, more than anything, unsettled the stillness. She didn't rush to defend herself. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't bend down to retrieve what had just been dismissed. She simply stood, as if the moment hadn't ended yet, as if something unseen was still unfolding beneath the surface of what everyone thought they understood. A security guard shifted near the glass doors, his hand hovering close to his radio but not quite touching it. The air felt thinner, stretched between expectation and something no one had named. Richard exhaled through his nose, glancing briefly at the small crowd that had formed in the periphery of the scene. I suggest you leave, he said, quieter now, but firmer, the authority in his tone sharpened by the audience. Ava tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in consideration, like she was weighing something only she could see. Then, almost gently, she spoke. Then maybe, she said, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the polished room. You should take another look. The words didn't rise. They didn't push. They settled. And in the space they occupied, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to make the silence feel different this time, heavier, like it was waiting to be broken by something far bigger than a torn piece of paper. The pieces of paper remained where they had fallen, untouched, like a quiet test no one wanted to step into. Ava Johnson did not bend to pick them up. She did not rush to explain herself. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, the soft rubber sole of her sneaker pressing against the cool marble floor, grounding her in a space that clearly did not expect her to belong. Up close, there was nothing remarkable about her appearance to the untrained eye. Her coat was clean but modest, the fabric slightly worn at the edges. Her hair was pulled back neatly, not styled for attention, just for ease. No jewelry caught the light. No designer labels announced her presence. She looked like someone who understood how to move through a world that often chose not to see her. And yet there was something else, something harder to name, resting in the stillness of her posture. Behind the counter, one of the junior tellers leaned closer to another, whispering just enough to be heard but not enough to be called out. Did you see the amount? She murmured, her voice carrying a mix of disbelief and quiet curiosity. The other teller gave a small shake of her head, eyes flicking between Ava and the torn check on the floor, as if trying to solve a puzzle that did not fit the usual patterns. Richard Collins followed their glance for a fraction of a second before straightening again, his jaw tightening. He had seen situations like this before. Or at least he believed he had. People walking in with confidence that did not match their presentation. Numbers that did not match expectations. Stories that unraveled under scrutiny. It was part of his job to filter, to decide, to maintain order in a place built on trust and verification. And yet something about this moment felt slightly off, like a detail just out of reach. Ava's gaze drifted briefly across the room, not searching for support, not appealing to anyone watching, but simply taking in the space. The high ceilings. The polished counters. The quiet hierarchy of movement that dictated who stood where and who was allowed to speak. She had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where silence said more than words ever could. A memory flickered across her expression, subtle and fleeting, like a reflection passing over glass. A younger version of herself standing in a different building, holding a folder too tightly, waiting to be acknowledged. Waiting to be seen. She had learned quickly back then that recognition was not given freely. It was measured, weighed, and often withheld. The security guard took a cautious step forward now, not aggressive, not confrontational, but ready, his presence a reminder of boundaries that had already been drawn. Ava noticed the movement without turning her head. Her breathing remained even, her shoulders relaxed, as if the tension in the room had chosen not to settle on her. "I am not asking for anything unusual," she said quietly, her voice steady, each word placed with intention. "I am asking you to verify what is already there." Richard's expression hardened slightly, the faint crease between his brows deepening. "And I am telling you," he replied, his tone controlled, "that we have procedures for a reason." He gestured briefly toward the counter, toward the systems behind it, toward the invisible structure that supported his authority. Ava nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of understanding. She had expected this. Not the torn paper, perhaps, but everything that came with it. The doubt. The assumptions. The quiet dismissal wrapped in professional language. She glanced down once more at the two halves of the check, the ink still bold, still certain, despite what had just been done to it. Then she looked back up, her eyes calm, unwavering, carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to be raised to be felt. Somewhere deeper in the building, a phone began to ring, faint at first, then clearer as it was picked up. A voice answered. Another paused. And in that small, distant exchange, something began to shift, though no one at the counter had realized it yet. The ringing phone did not stop after the first answer. It carried through the internal lines like a signal moving faster than anyone in the lobby could track, passed from one desk to another, each voice on the other end sharpening slightly with every transfer. Richard Collins did not hear the words yet, but he noticed the change in rhythm. The teller closest to the back office stiffened mid-sentence, her posture straightening as she pressed the receiver tighter to her ear. "Can you repeat that?" she asked, quieter now, her earlier skepticism replaced with something more cautious. Ava Johnson remained still at the counter, her gaze no longer fixed on Richard but somewhere just beyond him, as if she could already sense the shift before it fully arrived. The security guard paused where he stood, no longer advancing, his attention drawn not to Ava but to the sudden tension rippling behind the counter. One of the assistant managers stepped out from a glass-walled office, adjusting his sleeves as he approached, his expression composed but alert, like someone who had just been interrupted in the middle of something routine and now sensed it might not be routine at all. "What is going on here?" he asked, his tone controlled, scanning the scene, the torn check on the floor, the gathered onlookers, Richard standing firm behind the counter. Richard did not hesitate. "Attempted fraud," he said, the words landing with confidence, practiced and immediate. "Unverified check. Unusual amount. No prior account activity that supports it." He gestured briefly toward Ava without fully looking at her, as if the explanation alone should be enough. The assistant manager nodded once, but his eyes did not leave the teller. Still on the phone. Her face had changed. The skepticism was gone. In its place was something closer to uncertainty, the kind that made people speak more carefully, listen more closely. "Sir?" she said, covering the receiver with her hand as she turned slightly toward Richard, her voice lowered but urgent. "They are asking for the routing number again. They say it matches." Richard's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed. "That is not possible," he replied, his tone sharper now, the certainty still there but no longer effortless. "Double-check it." The teller nodded quickly, returning to the call, her fingers moving across the keyboard with more precision now, each keystroke deliberate. The assistant manager took another step closer to the counter, his attention narrowing. "Where did the check originate?" he asked. Ava's voice came before Richard could answer. "Internal account," she said calmly. "Private division." The words were simple, but they did not fit the narrative Richard had already built. He turned to her then, fully this time, his eyes searching for something he had missed. "That division does not process transactions at this level without prior authorization," he said. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "It does," she replied softly, "when it is authorized by the right person." The assistant manager glanced between them, the tension now visible in the slight shift of his stance. Behind him, the teller's voice rose just enough to carry. "Yes, I understand," she said into the phone, her tone careful. "I will hold." She lowered the receiver slowly, her hand lingering on it as if unsure whether to let go. "They are transferring the call," she said, looking directly at Richard now. "From corporate." The word landed differently. Corporate. It carried weight that did not belong to the everyday transactions of the branch. Richard straightened again, but this time the movement was less automatic, more deliberate, as if he were recalibrating his position in a situation that had shifted without his permission. The assistant manager's expression tightened slightly, the first hint that control might not be where he had assumed it was. Ava did not move. She did not reach for the torn pieces of the check. She did not press her case. She simply stood, her presence steady, her silence now louder than anything being said around her. The phone rang again behind the counter, sharper this time, and when the teller picked it up, the room seemed to lean in without realizing it, as if every person there understood, without being told, that whatever came next would not fit the version of the story they had already decided was true. The phone call did not begin with an introduction. It began with silence on the other end, the kind that made the teller straighten before a single word was spoken. "This is Rachel at the downtown branch," she said carefully, her voice suddenly more formal, more measured than before. A pause followed, longer than expected, and when the reply came, it was low, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative. "Put your branch manager on the line." Rachel's fingers tightened slightly around the receiver. "Yes, sir," she replied, her eyes lifting immediately to Richard Collins. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted again, deeper this time, like a floor settling beneath weight that had just been revealed. Richard stepped forward, his expression composed, though the precision of it now felt practiced rather than natural. He reached for the phone, his hand steady, but not effortless. "This is Richard Collins," he said, his tone professional, the same tone he had used in countless routine calls. Another pause. Then a question, simple and direct. "Did you process or reject a check presented moments ago?" Richard's gaze flicked briefly toward Ava Johnson, then back to the counter, to the two torn halves still lying on the marble floor. "I rejected it," he answered. "The documentation did not meet verification standards." There was no immediate response. Just a quiet breath on the other end, almost inaudible, but enough to stretch the silence. Then, slowly, the voice returned. "Describe the check." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. $20 million, he said. "Unusual presentation. No prior indication of activity from the individual." Another pause. This one heavier. The kind that did not feel like thinking, but like confirming something already known. Behind him, the assistant manager shifted his stance, his earlier confidence fading into a more cautious awareness. Rachel stood frozen beside the counter, her hand hovering near the keyboard, as if she did not trust herself to move. Ava remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm, as if the outcome of this call had never been in question for her. The voice on the phone spoke again, slower now, each word placed with deliberate clarity. "That check was authorized." The sentence did not rise. It did not need to. It settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. Richard's grip on the receiver tightened just enough to be noticed. "Authorized by whom?" he asked, his voice still controlled, but no longer effortless. There was a brief pause, then a response that carried something more than authority. It carried finality. By the primary account holder. The words hung in the air, unanswered, unfinished, like a door opening without explanation. Richard's eyes flicked once more toward Ava, this time lingering a fraction longer, searching for something he had overlooked, something that did not match the version of events he had constructed just minutes earlier. The assistant manager's expression shifted, the first clear sign of uncertainty breaking through his composure. Rachel swallowed quietly, her attention fixed on Richard, waiting for his next response, though none came immediately. The voice on the phone continued, now sharper, more direct. "Did you confirm the routing number?" Richard hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "It was in the process," he said. "Then you should complete that process," the voice replied, without raising its volume, without softening its tone. "Immediately." The line did not disconnect, but it did not continue either. It remained open, waiting. Richard lowered the receiver slightly, not fully removing it from his ear, as if unsure whether to speak again or listen. The room had gone completely still now. No whispers. No movement. Just the faint hum of the building's systems and the quiet presence of a moment that had begun to outgrow the assumptions that created it. Ava Johnson did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood, her calm now no longer blending into the background, but defining it. Richard Collins did not lower the phone completely, but he did not speak into it either. The silence on the line stretched, no longer empty, but expectant, as if the voice on the other end had already said enough. Behind the counter, Rachel's fingers hovered above the keyboard, waiting for instruction that had not yet been given. The assistant manager shifted again, slower this time, his earlier certainty replaced by something more cautious, more observant. "Richard," he said quietly, not a command, not a suggestion, but a recognition that the moment had changed. Richard exhaled through his nose, his gaze dropping briefly to the torn check on the floor. The two halves lay exactly where they had fallen, the printed numbers still aligned enough to read, still precise, still valid, despite what had been done to them. He moved then, stepping around the edge of the counter, each step measured, deliberate, as if the distance between him and that paper had grown heavier than it should have been. The marble floor reflected his movement in fragments, the overhead lights breaking across the polished surface. He bent down, slower than expected, his hand pausing just above the paper before finally lifting the first piece, then the second. The edges did not align cleanly anymore. The tear had been too sharp, too certain. For a moment, he held them together, as if trying to reverse something that could not be undone. Ava Johnson watched without moving, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, not on the paper, but on him. There was no satisfaction there. No quiet triumph. Just presence. Just awareness. Richard turned slightly, placing the pieces carefully on the counter this time, no longer dismissing them, no longer treating them as irrelevant. "Run the routing number again," he said, his voice lower now, controlled, but stripped of the earlier certainty. Rachel nodded immediately, her fingers moving quickly across the keys, the soft tapping of plastic filling the silence that had settled over the room. The assistant manager stepped closer, his attention fixed on the screen, his posture no longer relaxed, his arms no longer loosely folded, but engaged, attentive, as if he, too, understood that whatever appeared next would matter. The system processed the input. A brief pause. Then a line of text appeared, followed by another, then a full account profile expanding across the monitor. Rachel's breath caught, just enough to be heard. "It is verified," she said, her voice quieter now, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might change what she was seeing. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in recalculation. "Access the account holder details," he said. Rachel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied, navigating through layers of internal permissions that required more than routine clearance. The assistant manager leaned in, his expression tightening as the system prompted for additional authentication. "This is a restricted account," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Private division, Ava said softly, her voice entering the space without force, but with clarity that did not need volume. Richard did not respond to her. Not immediately. His focus remained on the screen, on the information unfolding in front of him, piece by piece, like a story revealing itself too late. Rachel entered the final credentials, her hands steady despite the tension in her shoulders. The system paused again, longer this time, as if acknowledging the level of access being requested. Then the profile loaded. Not partially. Not with delay. Fully. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, the change subtle but unmistakable. The assistant manager straightened, his posture shifting as he read the name displayed on the screen, then glanced instinctively toward Ava, then back again, as if confirming something he did not expect to be true. Richard did not speak. He stared at the monitor, the pieces of the check resting just inches from his hand, the number still visible, still undeniable. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was heavier now. Clearer. Like something that had been questioned moments ago was no longer a question at all. No one spoke when the name finished loading on the screen. It did not flash. It did not animate. It simply appeared, clean and undeniable, formatted in the same quiet font the system used for every account, as if it were no different from any other. But everything in the room shifted the moment it settled into place. Rachel's hand slowly pulled back from the keyboard, her fingers curling slightly as if they no longer trusted the surface beneath them. The assistant manager inhaled, then stopped midway, his chest holding the breath like he had forgotten how to release it. Richard Collins did not move at first. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, reading the same line again, not because he had missed it, but because his mind had not caught up to what it meant. Ava Johnson. Primary account holder. Executive authority, full. Ownership classification, controlling interest. The words did not raise their voice, but they carried weight that did not need sound. Somewhere in the distance, a printer resumed its quiet rhythm, the soft whirring almost out of place now, like a normal detail that no longer belonged to the moment. Richard's grip on the edge of the counter tightened slightly, then released. His reflection stared back at him from the glass panel behind the terminal, but it looked different now, less certain, less anchored. He glanced down at the torn check again, the paper no longer just an object, but a mistake made visible. Slowly, he reached for the two halves and aligned them more carefully this time, pressing the edges together with a precision that felt almost deliberate, as if the act itself might restore something beyond the paper. Ava watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet depth in her gaze now, not judgment, not anger, just recognition. She had seen this moment before. Not in this building. Not with this man. But in other forms, in other rooms, in the spaces where perception arrived before truth had a chance to speak. Richard lifted his eyes from the check and looked at her again, fully this time, not past her, not around her, but directly at her. For the first time since she had walked through the doors, he did not speak immediately. The words did not come as easily now. They had to be chosen. The assistant manager stepped back slightly, his earlier proximity to the situation replaced by distance, not physical, but instinctive, as if he understood that this moment no longer belonged to him. Rachel remained still, her attention moving between the screen and Ava, her expression no longer skeptical, but searching, trying to reconcile the image she had formed with the reality in front of her. The security guard near the entrance relaxed his stance almost imperceptibly, his hand lowering away from his radio, the tension that had drawn him forward now dissolving into uncertainty. Ava shifted her gaze briefly toward the counter, toward the reconstructed check, then back to Richard. "You have what you need now," she said softly. Her voice did not rise. It did not demand. It simply existed in the space, clear and grounded. Richard nodded once, the motion small, but deliberate. "Yes," he replied, his tone quieter than before, the sharp edges gone, replaced by something more measured, more aware. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with everything that had just been revealed, everything that had been assumed, and everything that could not be undone. The light from the ceiling fixtures reflected across the polished surfaces again, but it felt different now, less cold, less distant, as if the room itself had shifted with the understanding that had just settled inside it. Ava did not move to take the check. She did not step closer. She simply stood, steady and composed, allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was, without rushing it forward, without softening it, without needing to say anything more. Richard Collins finally lowered the phone back into its cradle, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, as if it marked the end of something he had not realized he was losing. His eyes remained on Ava Johnson, but the way he looked at her had changed completely. The confidence that once framed his posture was gone, replaced by a careful awareness, as though every word he might say now carried consequences he could no longer control. He cleared his throat, the sound quiet but noticeable in a room that had learned to listen. "Ms. Johnson," he began, the name deliberate, respectful in a way it had not been before. The assistant manager glanced at him, then quickly looked away, as if witnessing something private despite standing in the middle of a public space. Richard's hand rested near the torn check, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper, not to move it, but to acknowledge it. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone measured, each word placed carefully, as if he were stepping across something fragile. Ava did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained steady, her posture unchanged, her silence now holding more presence than any interruption could have. Richard continued, though more slowly this time. "Your account is, of course, valid," he added, the phrase sounding formal, procedural, but underneath it there was something else, something closer to recognition than obligation. Rachel shifted slightly behind the counter, her earlier uncertainty now replaced by a quiet attentiveness, as if she were watching a moment she would remember long after it ended. The assistant manager adjusted his stance again, but this time it was not to assert control. It was to step back, to allow space for something he understood did not belong to him. Richard inhaled, then exhaled slowly, the motion visible in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders. "I would like to correct this immediately," he said, his voice softer now, less authoritative, more human. He lifted the two halves of the check again, aligning them carefully, smoothing the edges as best he could, though the tear remained visible, a clean line that could not be hidden. "We can reissue the transaction," he continued, his eyes briefly dropping to the paper before returning to Ava. "With your approval." The words lingered, not because they were complex, but because of what they implied. Permission. Deference. A reversal that did not need to be announced to be understood. Ava's gaze moved from his face to the check, then back again, her expression still calm, still composed, but now carrying a quiet depth that seemed to settle into the space between them. She took a small step forward, not hurried, not hesitant, simply measured, closing the distance by inches rather than feet. The movement alone shifted the balance of the room. "You had everything you needed before," she said gently, her voice steady, not accusing, not raised, just clear. The words did not strike. They settled. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in defense, but in understanding. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, his earlier certainty replaced by something more grounded, more aware. Around them, the bank had gone completely still again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. It was no longer built on assumption or control. It was built on realization. Ava reached out, her hand hovering briefly above the check before resting lightly on the counter beside it, not taking it, not claiming it, but simply being present with it. "Go ahead," she said quietly. The permission was given without emphasis, without condition, but it carried more authority than anything that had been spoken before. Richard nodded again, this time more firmly, as if anchoring himself to the moment he now understood he had misjudged. He turned slightly toward Rachel, his voice steady but transformed. "Process the transaction," he said. And for the first time since the check had been torn, the words did not sound like control. They sounded like correction. The system processed the request with a quiet efficiency that felt almost out of place after everything that had just happened. Rachel's fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain, each keystroke precise, deliberate, as if the act of entering the transaction carried a weight she now fully understood. The screen refreshed once, then again, lines of confirmation appearing one after another, each one validating what had already been proven but not believed. The assistant manager watched closely, his arms now resting at his sides, no longer folded, no longer guarded, his posture open in a way that suggested he had stepped out of the role he had been holding just minutes earlier. Richard Collins remained at the counter, his hand still near the check, though he no longer touched it, as if he understood that some actions could not be repeated, only acknowledged. Ava Johnson stood quietly across from him, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a softness in the room now that had not existed before, a shift that did not come from words, but from recognition. "Transaction confirmed," Rachel said finally, her voice clear, but quieter than it had been earlier, as if the room itself required a different tone now. She looked up at Ava, meeting her eyes for the first time without hesitation, without assumption, just awareness. Ava gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, the kind that did not elevate the moment, but grounded it. Richard inhaled slowly, then spoke again, his voice measured, careful, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Ms. Johnson," he said, the name now carrying a weight he had not assigned to it before. "I want to apologize." The words did not rush out. They were placed deliberately, each one chosen, each one owned. The assistant manager shifted slightly, not to interrupt, but to witness, his earlier distance replaced by quiet attention. Richard continued, his gaze steady, not looking away this time. "I made a judgment without verifying the facts. That was my mistake." The admission did not raise his voice. It did not attempt to justify. It simply existed, clear and direct. Ava listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her calm now defining the pace of the moment. For a brief second, the room held its breath again, not in tension, but in expectation of what might follow. Ava glanced briefly toward the counter, toward the processed transaction, then back at Richard. "You did what you believed your role required," she said softly. Her voice did not accuse. It did not dismiss. It acknowledged. Richard's expression shifted slightly, the tightness in his features easing just enough to reveal something more human beneath it. Ava continued, her tone steady, her words simple but precise. "But roles do not replace awareness." The sentence settled into the space between them, not as a correction, but as a truth that did not need to be emphasized to be understood. Richard nodded slowly, the motion more grounded now, as if he had accepted something beyond the moment itself. Behind him, Rachel adjusted the printed confirmation, placing it neatly on the counter, aligning it with care, as if the details mattered more now than they had before. The assistant manager stepped back another inch, giving space not because he was told to, but because he understood that this moment belonged to something larger than procedure. Ava reached forward then, her hand moving with the same quiet intention she had carried from the beginning. She picked up the reconstructed check, not to inspect it, not to examine the tear, but simply to hold it, to acknowledge what it had become. The paper was imperfect now, the line still visible, but it remained whole enough to represent what it needed to. She did not comment on it. She did not linger on it. She simply held it for a brief moment, then set it back down on the counter. The action was small, but it carried meaning that did not need explanation. Richard watched, not interrupting, not speaking, his earlier instinct to control replaced by a willingness to observe. Ava's gaze lifted once more, meeting his, steady and calm. "What matters," she said quietly, "is what you do after you realize." The words were not heavy. They did not demand. But they stayed. And in the silence that followed, they became the only thing that mattered. The moment did not end with applause or raised voices or sudden movement. It ended the way it had begun, in stillness, but this time the silence felt different, no longer sharp or uncertain, but settled, like something had found its place after being out of alignment. Ava Johnson stood for a second longer, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her fingers barely touching the cool surface of the marble. The reconstructed check remained in front of her, no longer dismissed, no longer questioned, simply present, its torn line now part of its story rather than its undoing. Around her, the bank slowly began to breathe again. A printer resumed its quiet rhythm. A customer near the entrance shifted their weight, lowering their phone completely this time. The security guard stepped back into his original position, his posture relaxed, no longer drawn forward by tension. But even as the room returned to motion, something had changed in the way people moved, in the way they looked, in the way they held their silence. Ava lifted the check once more, this time folding it carefully along the line that had once been forced apart, aligning it with precision, not to erase what had happened, but to carry it forward intact. She slipped it into her coat pocket with a small, deliberate motion, as if placing it exactly where it belonged. Richard Collins watched her, his expression steady now, but not empty. There was understanding there, and something else, something quieter, something that did not need to be named. He did not step forward. He did not attempt to extend the moment beyond what it was. He simply stood, allowing it to pass through him without interruption. Ava turned then, her movements smooth, unhurried, her steps measured as she walked away from the counter. The sound of her sneakers against the marble floor was soft, almost muted, but it carried through the space with a clarity that drew attention without demanding it. Heads turned, not abruptly, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been done, but not too late to change what comes next. She did not look back. She did not pause at the doors. The glass panels opened automatically as she approached, the outside lights spilling into the lobby, warmer than the controlled brightness inside. For a brief moment, she stood at the threshold, the light catching the edge of her coat, outlining her in a way that felt almost cinematic, but entirely real. Then she stepped through. The doors closed behind her with a soft, final sound, sealing the moment inside the building she had just left. Richard remained where he was, his hand resting lightly on the counter, his gaze fixed on the space she had occupied just seconds before. The assistant manager stood a few feet away, silent, no longer directing, no longer observing with authority, just present. Rachel adjusted the papers on her desk again, though there was nothing left to fix, her movements slower now, more thoughtful. No one spoke. No one needed to. The light from outside filtered through the glass, reflecting across the polished floor, stretching toward the counter, toward the place where everything had shifted. And in that quiet reflection, without words, without instruction, something deeper remained, not as a lesson spoken, but as a truth felt, steady and undeniable, long after the moment itself had passed.